The condensation on my crystal glass was the only thing colder than the look in my husband's eyes when he handed it to me, though he didn't actually look at me at all. He simply extended his arm, his fingers hovering over the rim until he felt the weight transfer, his gaze never wavering from Julian's face. That was the moment of impact, not a physical blow, but the heavy, undeniable realization that I had finally achieved total invisibility. I was no longer a person to them. I was a convenient shelf, a decorative fixture that happened to breathe. The humidity of the Virginia evening hung over the estate gardens like a wet wool blanket, thick with the scent of overripe jasmine and the damp, metallic tang of the nearby koi pond. My silk dress, a shade of deep moss that Elias had chosen because it matched the garden's shadows, clung to my skin in a way that felt like a slow suffocation. I stood there, my feet aching in heels that were designed for sitting, while the two of them paced the stone terrace. The heirloom emeralds around my neck felt like light weights, the cold gold settings biting into my collarbone. This necklace had belonged to Elia's grandmother, a woman who had allegedly died of a broken heart, though looking at the sheer mass of the stones, I suspected it was actually cervical strain. To Elias, these jewels were a brand, a way to signal to the world, and to Julian that his foundations were built on old, unshakable rock. He didn't realize that even rock can be eroded by a steady, silent drip of water. The shell company in Panama is already flagging, Julian said, his voice a low, jagged rasp. He was a man made of sharp angles and nervous energy, always smelling faintly of expensive scotch and desperation. He wiped a bead of sweat from his upper lip with a silk pocket square that cost more than my first car. If the audit moves toward the secondary accounts, the whole structure collapses. We need to move the 4 million before the Friday close, Elias. We're running out of shadows to hide in. Elias didn't flinch. He took a slow, deliberate drag from his cigar, the cherry red tip glowing like a warning light in the gathering dusk. You worry too much, Julian. The auditors are looking for ghosts, not math. We've layered the transfers through the construction bids. It's clean. By the time they realize the invoices are inflated, the money will be sitting in a trust that doesn't technically exist. They spoke with a reckless disregard for my presence that would have been insulting if it weren't so useful. They assumed my silence was a sign of emptiness, a void where a mind should be. To them, I was the trophy wife who spent her days at charity luncheons and her evenings as a silent backdrop to their power plays. They didn't think I understood the terminology of offshore accounts, wire transfers, or the delicate art of embezzlement. They didn't know that for 15 years I had been the one proofreading Elias' early contracts, or that my degree in forensic accounting, long buried under layers of social expectations, hadn't simply evaporated because I started wearing couture. I took a small, careful sip of my gin and tonic, the lime rind bitter on my tongue. I watched the way the light from the French doors caught the sweat on Elias' brow. He was arrogant, yes, but he was also becoming sloppy. His success had blinded him to his own mortality, and more importantly, to the fact that the person who knows where the bodies are buried is usually the one who helped pick out the shovels. I hadn't helped him bury these particular bodies, but I had watched from the window while he dug the holes. And the board, Julian pressed, his pacing becoming more frantic. The click of his leather soles on the bluestone was rhythmic, like a ticking clock. They aren't all idiots. Some of them are starting to ask why the overhead for the Richmond project has tripled in 6 months. Elias laughed, a hollow, booming sound that startled a heron from the edge of the pond. The board sees what I want them to see. I give them dividends and they give me their loyalty. It's a simple transaction. Besides, I've got the CFO in my pocket. He's got enough skeletons in his closet to start a graveyard. He won't say a word. I shifted my weight, the emeralds shifting with me, clicking softly against each other. Neither man looked my way. I was a ghost in my own garden. I began to catalog the details they were handing me: the Friday deadline, the Panama shell, the Richmond project, the CFO's leverage. It was a map etched in the air of a humid summer night, and I was the only one recording the coordinates. The air grew heavier as the sun finally dipped below the horizon, leaving the garden in a bruised purple twilight. The cicadas began their shrill electrical hum, a wall of sound that provided a perfect veil for their treasonous talk. I looked at Elias, really looked at him, and saw the cracks he thought he was hiding. There was a tremor in his hand as he reached for his glass, the one I was still holding. He took it from me without a word of thanks, his fingers cold against mine for a fraction of a second. He was scared even if he didn't know it yet. His arrogance was a shield, but it was made of glass, and Julian was the hammer that would eventually shatter it. "We need to be careful," Julian whispered, lining in close to Elias. "The feds have been sniffing around the firm's associates. If they get a whiff of the Cayman link—" "They won't," Elias snapped, his patience finally fraying. "Stop acting like a panicked schoolboy. We've played this game for a decade. We win because we're smarter and because we have the resources to stay invisible. Now go inside and get another bottle. We have work to do." As Julian scurried toward the house, Elias turned his back to me, staring out over the dark expanse of his kingdom. He looked powerful, standing there in his bespoke suit, framed by the lush, manicured chaos of the garden. But I saw the truth. I saw a man who had forgotten that the most dangerous person in the room isn't the one shouting, but the one who is listening. I let the silence stretch between us, a vast, cold ocean. I could have spoken. I could have warned him that his pride was outstripping his intellect. I could have told him that I'd seen the way Julian's eyes darted toward the exit every time a car pulled into the driveway, but I said nothing. I simply stood there, the weight of the heirloom jewelry no longer feeling like a shackle, but like armor. I let the humidity cling to me, let the darkness swallow the edges of the terrace, and waited. Time was the only currency that truly mattered, and unlike Elias, I had plenty of it to spend. I would let them build their own gallows, word by word, transfer by transfer, while I remained the silent, decorative fixture they so desperately believed me to be. The game was changing, and for the first time in years, I wasn't just a piece on the board, I was the one keeping score. The transition from the humid, blue-shadowed garden to the dining room was like stepping into a sterilized operating theater. The air conditioning hummed with a predatory efficiency, stripping the moisture from my skin and replacing the scent of damp earth with the sterile, expensive fragrance of lilies and floor wax. The dining table was a sprawling expanse of mahogany, polished to such a high gloss that it reflected the flickering candlelight like a dark, stagnant pool. Around it sat the players of Elia's inner circle, men with voices like gravel and women with smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes, their faces tightened by surgeons and secrets. I took my place at the foot of the table, the emeralds around my neck feeling heavier now, a physical manifestation of the role I was expected to play. I was the silent centerpiece, the elegant void at the end of the board. The 1982 Bordeaux was poured with a reverence usually reserved for religious rites. As the sommelier moved with ghostly precision, I watched the way the light caught the deep, blood-red liquid. When I finally raised the crystal rim to my lips, the wine didn't taste of the dark fruit or the toasted oak the label promised. Instead, it hit my tongue with a sharp, metallic tang, like licking the edge of a silver coin or the blade of a knife. It was cold and unforgiving, much like the conversation flowing around me. Julian sat to my right, his face already flushed from the pre-dinner scotch, his eyes darting toward Elia's with a mixture of sycophancy and simmering resentment. He was a man who felt the weight of his own secondary status, and tonight he was looking for a way to tip the scales. "You've been remarkably quiet tonight, even for you, Elena," Julian said, his voice cutting through the low murmur of the other guests. He didn't look at me directly. He addressed his comment to the room, making me the subject of an observation rather than a participant in a dialogue. He swirled his wine, the liquid staining the sides of his glass. It's a fascinating trait, really, that absolute stillness. It reminds me of those old dolls, beautifully painted, perfectly dressed, and entirely vacant behind the eyes. A few of the guests chuckled, a dry, brittle sound that echoed against the high ceilings. I felt the heat of their collective gaze, but I didn't flinch. I kept my expression neutral, my hands resting lightly on the edge of the table. I could feel the texture of the tablecloth beneath my fingertips, the heavy, starch-stiffened damask, white as a shroud and intricately woven with a pattern of vines that felt like braille against my skin. It grounded me, providing a physical anchor while Julian's mockery drifted through the air. "Don't be cruel, Julian," Elias said, though there was no real reprimand in his tone. He reached out and placed his hand on my shoulder. It was a gesture meant to appear affectionate, but it felt like a leaden weight, a claim of ownership. His thumb pressed into the base of my neck just above the emeralds, a subtle reminder of the power he believed he held over me. Elena's quietude is her greatest virtue. In a world of chattering fools, she is a sanctuary of silence. It's a sign of a simple mind, perhaps a lack of internal clutter, but it's a peaceful one. She doesn't trouble herself with the complexities of our world. "Do you, darling?" He didn't wait for an answer. He didn't expect one. He turned back to the man on his left, a developer from the city, and began discussing the zoning permits for the Richmond project. I sat there, the simple-minded sanctuary, and felt the last vestiges of my old self, the woman who might have been hurt by such words, simply evaporate. In its place was a cold, calculated hardening of resolve. It was a crystalline clarity that made the room seem sharper, the colors more vivid. I wasn't a doll, I was a recording device. I was a ledger. I was the silent witness to their slow, arrogant unraveling. I looked down at the silver fork resting beside my plate. It was heavy, sterling, and polished to a mirror finish. I could see my own reflection in the bowl of the spoon, distorted, elongated, but unmistakable. I watched Julian as he leaned in toward Elias, his movements becoming more erratic as the wine took hold. There was a frantic energy about him tonight, a desperation that he was trying to mask with bravado. He kept glancing toward the hallway that led to Elias' private study, his fingers drumming a restless rhythm on the mahogany. "The Richmond project is a gold mine, Elias," Julian said, his voice dropping an octave, though it still carried to my ears. "But we have to move now. The window is closing. If we don't finalize the transfers by Friday, the whole thing becomes a liability." Elias waved a dismissive hand. "It's handled, Julian. I've already moved the necessary files. Everything is in the black ledger. It's tucked away where no one will find it." My heart didn't skip a beat. It slowed down, becoming a steady, rhythmic thrum in my chest. I knew that ledger. It was a small, leather-bound book that Elias treated with the kind of obsession a religious zealot treats a holy relic. He usually kept it locked in the floor safe behind the mahogany desk, a space I was never permitted to enter. But as I looked through the double doors of the dining room toward the dimly lit mouth of the hallway, I saw something that Elias, in his wine-soaked arrogance, had missed. The door to his study was ajar. a sliver of light spilled out onto the Persian rug, and there, sitting precariously on the edge of the massive roll-top desk, was the corner of a black leather cover. It was a mistake. A small human error born of overconfidence and perhaps a bit too much of that metallic Bordeaux. Elias was slipping. The man who prided himself on his invulnerability had left a door open, literally and figuratively. I watched the way Julian's eyes snagged on that same sliver of light. He saw it too. I could see the wheels turning behind his florid brow, the calculation of a man who was tired of being the hammer and wanted to be the hand that swung it. The partnership was no longer a monolithic entity. It was a crumbling ruin held together by the thin mortar of mutual distrust. The dinner continued, a slow-motion car crash of ego and excess. Course after course was brought out: quail eggs, roasted lamb, delicate tarts that tasted of ash in my mouth. I played my part to perfection. I nodded when a guest looked my way. I smiled the vacant, pleasant smile Elias required. I remained the decorative fixture, the silent pond Julian had mocked. But beneath the surface, I was mapping the terrain. I was timing the movements of the staff, noting the frequency of the wine service, and measuring the distance between the dining table and the study. The air in the room seemed to thicken, the scent of the lilies becoming cloying, almost funereal. I focused on the physical world to keep the rising tide of adrenaline at bay. I felt the cool weight of the emeralds, the stiffness of the damask, the sharp edge of the silver. I was no longer a ghost in this house. I was the architect of its change. They had taken advantage of my silence for years, using it as a canvas upon which to project their own superiority. They thought my quietude was a vacuum, failing to realize that a vacuum is a powerful thing. It pulls everything into itself, leaving nothing behind but the void. As the guests finally began to rise, their voices a discordant symphony of forced laughter and insincere compliments, I felt a strange sense of peace. Elia's hand left my shoulder, and I felt the sudden lightness of the release. He didn't look back at me as he led the men toward the terrace for cigars. He didn't see me linger in the dining room, a shadow among shadows. He didn't see the way my eyes remained fixed on the sliver of light coming from the study. The game was no longer about survival. It was about the meticulous, patient collection of the debt they didn't even know they owed. I would let time handle the rest, but I would be the one to ensure that time moved exactly as I needed it to. I was the silent one, and in the end, my voice would be the only one that mattered. The morning after the dinner party, the house felt like a theater after the curtain had fallen. The lingering scent of stale smoke and expensive perfume clung to the drapes, a ghostly reminder of the performance we had all just endured. Elias was late to rise, his sleep heavy and fitful, fueled by the excess of the previous night. I, however, was wide awake. I moved through the quiet hallways with the practiced grace of a shadow, my footsteps muffled by the thick pile of the carpets. I found myself drawn back to the study, the door now firmly shut, but the memory of that sliver of light still burned in my mind. It was no longer a forbidden chamber, it was a map, and I was the cartographer. For years, I had been the woman who simply lived in the house, a piece of fine porcelain that required occasional dusting but no real attention. Now I was the archivist of their ruin. The routine of the following weeks became my liturgy. Every morning, after Elias had retreated into his sanctum with a cup of black coffee and a scowl that seemed etched into his very bones, I would wait. I would wait for the moment he left for his mid-morning meetings, or for the long lunches that inevitably turned into drinking sessions with Julian. Once the heavy oak door clicked shut and the roar of his car faded down the gravel driveway, I would enter. The atmosphere of the home office was a sensory assault, a dense, masculine soup of old paper, the lingering, acrid sweetness of expensive cigar smoke, and the constant, low-frequency hum of the computer towers tucked beneath the massive mahogany desk. It was a room designed to intimidate, filled with leather-bound books that no one ever read and brass ornaments that caught the light like dull weapons. I began my work with the wastebasket. It is a peculiar thing how much a man reveals by what he thinks he has destroyed. Elias, in his growing arrogance, had become careless with the shredder. I would sit on the edge of his ergonomic chair, the leather cool against my thighs, and meticulously piece together the fragments of his day. I found discarded notes on yellow legal pads, scrawled calculations, names of offshore accounts I didn't recognize, and frantic reminders to call Jay about the gap. The gap, I soon realized, was not a physical distance but a financial one, a chasm that was opening up beneath their feet, one they were trying to fill with increasingly desperate maneuvers. I didn't take the originals. I wasn't a thief in the traditional sense. Instead, I used the small, silent camera on my phone, documenting every scrap, every letter, every panicked scribble. I was a ghost in the machine, recording the data that would eventually delete them. As the days bled into weeks, I watched Elia's transformation from a position of invisible proximity. His paranoia was becoming a physical thing, a scent like ozone before a storm. He started checking the locks on the study door 3 times before leaving. He would stop mid-sentence during our rare, quiet dinners, his eyes darting toward the window as if he expected the very shadows to speak. He grew thin, the skin around his eyes tightening and turning a bruised, yellowish hue. He thought the threat was external competitors, regulators, perhaps even Julian. He never once looked at me. To him, I was still the silent pond, the woman who didn't understand the complexities of the business. He would vent his frustrations to the air while I sat 3 feet away, describing his fears in detail, assuming my silence was a sign of vacuity rather than absorption. Julian, on the other hand, was spiraling in a much louder fashion. He visited the house more frequently now, his arrivals heralded by the screech of tires and the smell of cheap gin masking expensive cologne. He was no longer the polished predator I had seen at the dinner party. His bespoke shirts were often wrinkled, his tie loosened as if it were a noose he was trying to escape. From my vantage point in the conservatory or the upstairs landing, I overheard their whispered arguments in the foyer. Julian's gambling debt was no longer a secret, it was a hemorrhage. He owed money to people who didn't care about his pedigree or his partnership with Elias. I watched through the crack of the door as he paced the study, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold his glass. He was pleading with Elias for a bridge loan, a term that sounded more like a ransom. I became a master of the incidental entry. I would walk into the study carrying a tray of tea or a stack of mail at the exact moment their voices reached a fever pitch. They would stop abruptly, their faces flushing with a mixture of guilt and annoyance. Elias would wave me away with a dismissive flick of his wrist, and Julian would offer a hollow, terrifyingly bright smile. In those few seconds, I would scan the desk, noting the open ledgers, the tabs on the computer screen, the names on the envelopes. I saw the way Julian's eyes would linger on Elia's safe, a look of predatory hunger that made my skin crawl. They were like two wolves trapped in a cage of their own making, and I was the one holding the key, watching them slowly begin to tear at each other's throats. The computer hummed a constant, mocking rhythm. On the rare occasions Elias left it logged in a mistake born of his mounting exhaustion, I discovered the digital breadcrumbs. I saw the transfers, the shell companies with names like Aura Holdings and Cypress Limited. I saw the emails to Julian filled with veiled threats and coded language. It was a symphony of malpractice, a masterpiece of greed that had finally become too heavy to carry. I documented it all, filing it away in the digital cloud I had created, a place where their secrets were safe until I decided they weren't. I was the calm, silent center of their storm. While they vibrated with the kinetic energy of their own destruction, I remained still. I was the clock on the wall, the dust on the shelf, the air they breathed, omnipresent and entirely ignored. Their vices were beginning to bleed into their public personas. Elias was losing his grip at the club, his outbursts during board meetings becoming the subject of hushed gossip. Julian was seen at the track, looking disheveled and desperate, his reputation as a man of means dissolving into the reality of a man in debt. They were no longer the titans of the city, they were crumbling statues, and I was the one noting every crack. I felt no pity for them. For years, they had used my silence as a canvas for their ego, projecting onto me whatever version of a wife or a friend's wife they needed at the time. They had assumed that because I didn't speak, I didn't see. They had assumed that because I didn't fight back, I had no weapons. Every evening, after the chaos of their day had subsided and the house was once again filled with the heavy, oppressive silence of their mutual distrust, I would sit in my dressing room. I would look at my reflection, the same calm, unreadable face they saw every day, and I would feel a cold, sharp sense of purpose. I was no longer waiting for time to handle the rest. I was the one directing the flow of time itself. I was gathering the tinder, the wood, and the oil. I was waiting for the perfect moment to strike the match, not out of anger, but out of a patient, calculated need for justice. They had taken advantage of my silence, thinking it was a void. They were about to learn that a void is not empty. It is simply waiting to be filled with the consequences of everything it has swallowed. I was the silent observer, and my documentation was the only truth that remained in a house built on lies. The debt was being tallied, the interest was accruing, and soon the collection would begin. I closed my eyes, listening to the hum of the house, the heartbeat of a dying empire, and I smiled. It was a small, secret thing, hidden in the dark, but it was the most honest thing I had felt in years. The air changed long before we reached the coast. It transitioned from the stagnant, exhaust-heavy heat of the city to something sharper, heavy with salt and the metallic tang of an approaching storm. Elias sat in the passenger seat of the SUV, his profile etched against the darkening sky like a tombstone. He didn't speak, but the silence between us wasn't the comfortable kind we had shared in our early years. It was a dense, pressurized thing, vibrating with the unspoken accusations he wanted to hurl at the world and perhaps at me. He looked older than his 55 years. His skin had taken on a grayish, translucent quality, like old vellum stretched too tight over a skull. In the harsh, intermittent light of the passing street lamps, I could see the fine, persistent tremor in his right hand, a ghost of a shake he tried to anchor by gripping his knee. We arrived at the coastal retreat on a Friday evening, the sky a bruised purple that promised no peace. Elias had insisted on the trip, a desperate attempt to recalibrate, as he called it, though we both knew it was merely a change of scenery for his slow motion unraveling. The house was a marvel of glass and cedar, perched precariously on a jagged cliff that overlooked the churning Atlantic. It was a place designed for reflection, but for Elias and Julian, who arrived shortly after us, it was a pressure cooker. Julian's car skidded on the gravel driveway with a violence that signaled his state of mind long before he stepped out. When the two of them stood together on the expansive deck that overhung the surf, the contrast was jarring. While Elias was wasting away, turning into a specter of his former self, Julian was a live wire. His left eye had developed a frantic, rhythmic twitch that pulsed in time with the vein in his temple. He looked bloated, his face flushed with a mixture of high-end scotch and the low-end panic of a man who realized his safety net had been shredded. They were a study in two different types of collapse, one imploding into a hollow shell, the other exploding into a frantic mess of nerves. I moved between them like a ghost, a soft-footed shadow in a cashmere wrap. I brought them tea with honey to soothe their jagged throats, and I arranged heavy wool blankets over their laps as if they were invalids instead of predators. I played the role of the devoted, slightly dim-witted wife to perfection, my voice a low, melodic hum that provided a background track to their escalating vitriol. They didn't even stop their arguments when I entered the room anymore. They had forgotten I was a person with ears and an intellect. To them, I was merely a fixture of the house, as unremarkable as the fireplace or the floorboards. He's asking for the liquidation, Elias, Julian hissed, his voice cracking against the rhythmic roar of the crashing waves below. If we don't move the offshore accounts by Monday, if we don't satisfy the Aura Holdings audit, the whole thing goes sideways. You promised me the buffer. You said the shell companies were airtight. Elias didn't look at him. He stared out at the black horizon where the sea met the sky, his gray skin appearing even more ghostly in the moonlight. There is no buffer, Julian. There is only the debt. You spent the buffer at the tables in Macau, and you spent the rest trying to buy your way out of that harassment suit. Don't lie to me, not here. The twitch in Julian's eye accelerated. It was fascinating to watch, a tiny biological rebellion against the pressure of his own failures. I set the tea tray down on the marble coffee table, the clink of china a sharp, delicate punctuation to their tension. More tea, Julian? I asked, my voice dripping with an artificial honeyed sweetness. You look so tired, dear. Perhaps a walk down to the pier tomorrow would clear your head. I heard that Marcus Thorne is staying at the inn nearby. He always spoke so highly of your business acumen. I'm sure he'd love a chat. The name Thorne hung in the air like a baited hook. Marcus Thorne was the one man who had the resources to bail Julian out, and he was also the one man who harbored a decade-long, simmering grudge against Elias over a hostile takeover that had ruined Thorne's father. I knew Julian was desperate enough to take the bait, even if the bait was attached to a landmine. I had spent weeks subtly feeding Julian information about Thorne's movements, making it seem like a series of social coincidences. I had even accidentally left a business card of Thorne's new venture on the library table where Julian would be sure to find it while searching for Elia's safe codes. Julian's gaze snapped to mine, his eyes wide and bloodshot, the whites yellowed from lack of sleep. For a second, a flicker of suspicion crossed his face, a brief realization that I was saying too much, knowing too much. But his greed and his terror quickly smothered the thought. To him, I was just his friend's flighty, observant wife making idle conversation about social acquaintances. He didn't see the trap I was laying. He saw a life raft. Thorne is here, Julian asked, his voice dropping an octave, becoming hushed and conspiratorial. I believe so, I replied, smoothing the fabric of my dress with a practiced, elegant motion. I saw his distinctive silver coupe at the village market this morning. Anyway, I'll leave you two to your business. The wind is picking up, and I think I'll retire early. Do try to get some rest, Elias. You look so pale. I left them there, two drowning men clutching at each other's throats while the ocean roared its cold approval below. In the bedroom, I didn't sleep. I sat by the floor-to-ceiling window and watched the reflection of the lighthouse sweep across the walls, a rhythmic pulse of light and dark. I thought about the documentation I had gathered on the laptop, the digital trail of Aura Holdings and Cyprus Limited that led directly to the safe in Elias' office. I had ensured that the meeting between Julian and Thorne would happen. I had even sent an anonymous tip to Thorne's office, hinting that a high-level partner in Elia's firm was ready to flip in exchange for a fresh start. It was a lie, of course. Julian was too deep in the mud to ever be clean, but it was the spark needed to set the tinder ablaze. The next morning, the house was silent, save for the whistling of the wind through the eaves. I found Elias in the kitchen, staring at a cup of cold, black coffee. His skin looked worse in the daylight, a sickly yellow-gray that suggested his internal organs were finally surrendering to the stress of his secrets. Looked up at me, and for the first time in years, I saw a flicker of actual naked fear in his eyes. "Where's Julian?" he asked, his voice a raspy whisper. "He went for an early walk," I said, leaning against the counter and watching the steam rise from the kettle. I felt a strange, detached sense of power. "He said he needed some air. He mentioned something about seeing an old friend for breakfast." Elia's grip tightened on his mug until his knuckles turned white and the porcelain groaned. He knew. He didn't know exactly what was happening, but he felt the shift in the atmosphere, the way the tectonic plates of his life were beginning to grind against each other. The silence he had relied on for so long, the silence he had forced upon me, was no longer his shield. It was a weight pressing down on his chest, suffocating him. He looked at me, really looked at me, searching for a sign of betrayal, but I gave him nothing but the same vacant, supportive smile I had worn for 20 years. I was the mirror he used to check his own ego, and today the mirror showed him exactly what he was, a man who had built a kingdom on sand, watching the tide come in. The physical toll was becoming undeniable. Elia's breathing was shallow, a wet, rattling sound that filled the quiet rooms. Julian returned an hour later, his twitching eye now accompanied by a manic, terrifying grin that didn't reach his eyes. He had met Thorne. I could see it in the way he carried his shoulders, the way he avoided Elia's gaze with a newfound predatory confidence. The betrayal was cooling in his veins, turning into a solid, heavy thing. I went back to the deck, the salt spray stinging my cheeks and coating my lips with brine. The ocean was a churning mess of slate and foam, beautiful in its indifference. I felt a profound sense of peace. The documentation was secure, the players were in position, and the clock was ticking. They had taken advantage of my silence, thinking it was a void. They never realized that silence is the most powerful weapon of all. It allows you to hear the things others miss. It allows you to see the cracks before the structure falls. And as the wind howled around the glass house, I knew the fall was only a matter of time. I was no longer the victim of their story. I was the one writing the final page. The garden had begun its slow, inevitable surrender to the frost. What was once a riot of verdant greens and defiant blooms was now a tapestry of copper, brittle gold, and the bruised purple of dying asters. I spent my afternoons there, wandering the stone paths with a pair of shears I rarely used, watching the way the moisture clung to the underside of rotting hosta leaves. There is a specific scent to a garden in autumn, a heavy, fermented musk of damp earth and decomposing stalks. It is the smell of things ending, the perfume of a graceful exit. To most, it is a season of melancholy, but to me, it felt like the most honest time of year. The mask of growth had been stripped away, revealing the skeletal truth of the branches and the exhaustion of the soil. It mirrored the rot in the empire Elias and Julian had built. The lush canopy of their success was thinning, and the crooked, diseased wood beneath was finally coming into view. Patience is not a passive act. It is a predatory stillness, a focused expenditure of energy that most people mistake for lethargy. They had mistaken my quiet for a lack of substance, never realizing that I was simply waiting for the season to change. While they barked into phones and paced the mahogany floors of the study, I watched the frost-blackened ferns curl into themselves. I understood that time does not need to be hurried, it merely needs to be observed. If you wait long enough, the weight of a man's own lies will eventually snap the branch he is standing on. Claire arrived in the late afternoon, her car engine a low, expensive purr against the gravel. Julian's wife was a woman constructed entirely of surfaces. She was younger than I, though the gap was closing as the years of chemical peels and surgical refinements began to give her face the translucent, fragile quality of pulled sugar. She stepped out of the vehicle, a vision in cream-colored cashmere and silk that rustled like dry leaves as she moved. She was as vacuous as the men believed me to be, but while my silence was a fortress, hers was a void. She filled the air with chatter because she was terrified of what she might hear if the world went quiet. "It's freezing out here, darling," she said, her voice a practiced lilt that never quite reached her eyes. She leaned in to brush her cheek against mine, the scent of her perfume, something sharp, floral, and obscenely expensive, clashing with the earthy smell of the dying garden. "How you can stand to stay out here amongst all this, Brown, is beyond me." "It's the cycle of things, Claire," I replied, my voice smooth and unremarkable. "Everything has to go back into the earth eventually." We moved toward the glass-walled sunroom, the transition from the crisp autumn air to the artificial warmth of the house feeling like a betrayal. I had set out the tea service, the fine Limoges porcelain that Elias insisted we use for guests, its gold rim worn thin by decades of polishing. The tactile nature of our interaction was a choreographed dance of manners. The silver spoon clinked against the side of the cup with a delicate, rhythmic chime. The silk of her sleeves hissed against the wicker chair. Claire took her tea with 3 lumps of sugar, stirring them with a frantic, obsessive energy. Her eyes darted around the room, settling on nothing. She was a woman who lived in the periphery of her husband's life, fueled by the scraps of status he allowed her to keep. She was the perfect conduit for the poison I was about to distill. "Julian is so stressed lately," she sighed, her manicured nails painted a shade of red that looked like dried blood, tapping a staccato beat against her saucer. "He's barely home, and when he is, he's just vibrating like a wire that's been pulled too tight. He says Elias is being difficult, unreasonable even." I took a slow sip of my tea, letting the warmth settle in my chest. "Elias isn't himself," I said softly, leaning forward as if sharing a confidence I shouldn't. "The doctor is worried about his heart, though he'd kill me for saying so. He thinks Julian is trying to edge him out before he's ready to go. He's become quite paranoid." I saw the spark of interest in her eyes. Information was the only currency Claire truly valued, and I was handing her a gold bar. "Edge him out," she whispered, the vacuousness momentarily replaced by a sharp, predatory curiosity. "Julian says he's the one holding everything together. He says Elias is the one making the mistakes." "I'm sure that's how it looks from Julian's perspective," I said, my voice dripping with feigned sympathy. "But Elias mentioned something the other night. Something about a man named Thorne. He seemed convinced that Julian was meeting with him behind his back. I told him it was impossible, of course. Julian would never be so disloyal." The name Thorne hit her like a physical blow. She didn't know the specifics of the business. She didn't have the stomach for the grit, but she knew the names of the enemies. Her grip on the teacup tightened, her knuckles white beneath the layers of expensive rings. The unspoken lies hung in the air between us, thick and suffocating. I watched her process the information, watching her vanity struggle with her fear. If Julian was making a move, she wanted to be on the winning side. If Julian was failing, she needed to know how to protect her own interests. "Thorne," she repeated, the word tasting bitter on her tongue. "He's a vulture. Julian wouldn't. He couldn't." Of course not, I reassured her, my smile a masterpiece of vacant support. But you know how men are when they feel their power slipping. They see shadows everywhere. I just worry that Elias might do something drastic if he thinks Julian is flipping. He's always said that if he goes down, he's taking everyone into the furnace with him. I watched the color drain from her face. She wasn't thinking about the business or the legacy or the morality of their actions. She was thinking about her closets full of furs, her summer home in the Hamptons, and the social standing that was her only identity. I had planted the seed of doubt, and now I would let her vanity water it. She would go back to Julian, or perhaps she would find a way to accidentally mention my concerns to Elias during their next dinner. Either way, the friction between the two men would turn into fire. The afternoon sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the sunroom floor. The orange light caught the dust motes dancing in the air, making them look like sparks. Claire stood up, her silk dress rustling with a newfound agitation. She was eager to leave now, eager to carry her new burden of secrets to someone who would pay more for them. I should go, she said, her voice slightly breathless. Julian expects me back for a charity gala. It's all so exhausting, isn't it? Exhausting, I agreed, walking her to the door. As she drove away, the silence of the house settled back over me like a heavy cloak. I returned to the garden for one last walk before the dark took hold. The air was colder now, the wind picking up and rattling the dry stalks of the sunflowers. I thought about the men in that study, the way they used words to build walls and silence to hide their crimes. They had never understood that I was not a wall, I was the earth they were standing on. I was the slow, patient decay that eventually claims everything. The tea was cold when I went back inside, but I didn't mind. I sat in the darkening living room, listening to the house groan as it settled. In the distance, I heard the heavy tread of Elia's footsteps on the stairs, slow and labored. He was a man dying of his own secrets, and soon Julian would be the one to provide the final blow. I had done nothing but speak a few well-placed truths and allow the vacuum of their own greed to do the rest. The season of rot was truly here, and for the first time in 20 years, I felt like I could finally breathe. The silence was no longer a cage, it was the sound of the end. The collapse didn't come with a single cinematic bang. It arrived as a series of 1,000 tiny, jagged paper cuts. It began in earnest only 3 days after Claire's visit, a shift in the atmosphere so palpable it felt like a drop in barometric pressure before a lethal storm. The phone calls, which had once been measured, arrogant, and conducted behind the heavy oak doors of the study, suddenly hemorrhaged into the rest of the house. They became frantic staccato bursts of noise that punctured the midnight air and bled into the early hours of the morning. I would lie in my bed, staring at the intricate plaster molding of the ceiling, listening to the muffled roar of Elia's voice vibrating through the floorboards. It was a sound I had grown to recognize over the decades, the sound of a man drowning in the rising tide of his own hubris. By the fourth night, the 3:00 a.m. calls became the new rhythm of the household. I didn't need an alarm clock anymore. The sharp, rhythmic vibration of the downstairs extension was enough to pull me from a shallow sleep. I would rise without a word, wrap my silk robe tightly around me, and descend into the chaos they had invited through the front door. The study, which had always been a sanctuary of polished leather, rare books, and the expensive scent of peated scotch, had been transformed into a frantic war room of desperation. The air in there was different now, thick with the ozone smell of the heavy-duty paper shredder that ran almost constantly, and the sour, unmistakable tang of old sweat and high-voltage anxiety. Elias sat at the center of the wreckage, his silk tie loosened until it hung like a frayed noose around his neck, his crisp white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that looked suddenly, shockingly frail. Julian was often there too, his usual youthful polish replaced by a manic, twitchy energy that made him look like he was vibrating out of his own skin. They didn't look like the titans of industry they pretended to be. They looked like cornered animals trying to chew their way out of a steel trap of their own making. I became the ghost that fed the beast. I would enter the room with a heavy silver tray, the fine porcelain cups clinking softly against each other, a sound that felt obscenely delicate and civilized against the backdrop of their guttural shouting. They never looked at me, not once. To them, I was merely an extension of the architectural landscape, a biological machine designed to provide caffeine and remove the physical debris of their panic. I would set the coffee down, my movements slow, deliberate, and entirely rhythmic, while Elias screamed into a speakerphone at some terrified underling in a time zone half a world away. "I don't care about the legal optics," he would bellow, his face a bruised, unhealthy shade of purple that made the veins in his temples throb. "Move the assets now. If that ledger goes public before the weekend, we are all dead in the water. Do you hear me? Dead." I would bend down with a grace I didn't know I still possessed to pick up the stray strips of paper that had missed the wastebasket. The shredded documents felt like confetti for a funeral. I ran my fingers over the jagged edges of the paper, feeling the tactile texture of their dying secrets. Names of shell companies, offshore accounts, wire transfer numbers, all reduced to thin, meaningless white ribbons. They thought they were erasing their tracks, but they were only creating a larger mess for me to manage. I took a strange, cold pleasure in the orderliness of my task. While their world was fracturing into a million jagged, irreconcilable pieces, I was the one who kept the room tidy. I was the one who ensured the trash was taken out, that the evidence of their failure was bagged, tagged, and moved quietly to the curb. As the days blurred into a single, unending crisis, the power shift became a physical sensation in my chest, a humming vibration of total autonomy. It was a quiet thrill that grew stronger every time Elias asked me where his reading glasses were, or when Julian, his voice cracking with exhaustion, begged me to find a specific blue file he'd misplaced in his delirium. They were losing control of the very reality they inhabited. They couldn't remember if they had eaten. They couldn't remember what day of the week it was. They relied on me to define the parameters of their existence. "It's Tuesday, Elias," I would say, my voice a smooth, soothing balm applied over his jagged nerves. "You have a conference call with the auditors in 20 minutes. I've laid out your charcoal suit in the dressing room. You should change, you smell of the office." He would look at me then, his eyes unfocused and bloodshot, and for a fleeting, delicious second, I saw the raw terror of a lost child in his gaze. He was a man who had spent 40 years commanding thousands of employees and moving millions of dollars with a flick of his pen, yet he couldn't even manage his own wardrobe or his own hygiene without my intervention. I would pat his hand, the skin felt like dry, cold parchment, and lead him toward the stairs like an invalid. I wasn't just his wife or his housekeeper in those moments, I was his keeper. I was the one who decided when he slept, when he ate, and exactly how much of the terrifying outside world I would allow to filter through the heavy velvet curtains. The shouting matches between Elias and Julian became more frequent and more violent as the walls closed in. They were no longer partners in crime. They were two desperate men on a sinking life raft, each trying to push the other overboard to buy a few more minutes of air. I would stand in the darkened hallway, hidden by the deep shadows of the corridor, and listen to the accusations fly back and forth like poisoned arrows. "You're the one who signed off on the Thorn deal. Julian would hiss, his voice thin and reedy. You wanted the leverage, Elias. You told me it was a sure thing, a legacy maker. And you're the one who leaked the internal memo to the press, you little rat. Elias would roar back, the sound of a heavy crystal glass shattering against the mahogany wall punctuating his words. I know it was you. Claire told me you were looking for an exit strategy months ago. She told me everything. I smiled in the dark, my back pressed against the cold wallpaper. The seed I had planted in Claire's mind had bloomed into a magnificent, poisonous flower. She had done exactly what I expected. She had weaponized my manufactured concerns to protect her own interests, and in doing so, she had severed the last thread of trust between the two men. They were tearing each other apart with their own teeth, and all I had to do was keep the coffee hot and the room quiet enough for them to hear the frantic racing of their own hearts. There is a specific, heavy kind of silence that follows a truly great collapse. It's not merely the absence of sound, but the oppressive presence of a void. By the end of the week, the shouting had finally stopped. The phones had gone quiet because there were no more lies left to tell and no one left in the city willing to believe them. The firm was under federal investigation, the stocks were worthless digital ghosts, and the vultures like Thorne were already circling the remains, picking at the soft tissue of the estate. I walked into the study at 4:00 a.m. on the eighth day of the crisis. The room was freezing, the fire in the hearth had long since died out, and neither of them had the presence of mind to stoke it. Elias was slumped in his high-backed chair, staring at a blank, glowing computer screen that cast a ghoulish blue light over his features. Julian was gone. He had fled into the night hours ago, likely toward a lawyer or a private airport, though I knew he wouldn't get far. The authorities were already waiting at the perimeter of their lives. I didn't turn on the overhead lights. I preferred the gray, pre-dawn gloom of the room. I walked over to Elias and placed a fresh cup of herbal tea on the desk, the steam rising in a thin, elegant curl. He didn't move. He looked like a statue carved from salt, brittle, white, and ready to dissolve. I began to tidy the desk, stacking the few remaining files into neat surgical piles as if I were preparing a body for a viewing. It's over, isn't it? He whispered. His voice was so thin I felt I could see right through it. The chaos is over, Elias, I replied, my voice steady, clear, and devoid of the performative sympathy I had used for years. Now comes the reckoning. That is a different kind of work entirely. I reached out and adjusted his collar, my fingers lingering for a second too long near the pulse point of his throat. For years, this man had used his voice to silence me, to diminish my intellect, and to make me feel like a supporting character in the grand, ego-driven epic of his life. Now, he was nothing more than a broken prop in a play that had reached its final, inevitable act. I felt a surge of cold, crystalline clarity. I had waited 20 years for this specific silence. I had endured the dismissals, the casual infidelities, and the sharp, biting cruelties, all while building a foundation of my own beneath his very feet. He looked up at me then, and for the first time in our entire marriage, he truly saw me, not as the woman who organized his charity galas or the woman who bore his name as a piece of social jewelry, but as the architect of his current, crushing solitude. He saw the way I held myself, back straight, eyes calm, hands perfectly steady. He saw that while he had been losing everything he valued, I had been gaining the only thing that actually mattered, the power to walk away from the wreckage without a single scratch on my skin. You knew, he breathed, a horrific realization finally dawning in his hollow, sunken eyes. You knew Thorne was moving in. You knew about the leverage before I did. I know many things, Elias, I said, picking up the empty tray and turning toward the door. I know how to listen. It's a skill you never bothered to learn because you were too busy listening to yourself. I walked toward the door, my footsteps silent on the thick Persian rug. I didn't look back at him. The house was finally mine, not because of a deed, a title, or a will, but because I was the only person left who knew how to live within these walls without the crutch of power or the shield of a lie. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape of absolute ruin, and I was the only one who knew where the bodies were buried, because I was the one who had handed them the shovels. The corridor felt longer than it had 20 years ago, or perhaps it was just that the air was finally thin enough to breathe. I moved through the shadows, the silence of the house no longer a weight but a cloak. Behind me in that study, Elias was a ghost in his own life, haunted by the realization that his sanctuary was actually a cage I had spent decades gilding. I remembered the exact moment the bars had clicked shut. It wasn't during our final confrontation, but hours earlier when the rain had been a relentless gray curtain against the floor to ceiling windows. He had come in from the terrace, his expensive wool blazer soaked through, clinging to his narrow shoulders like a shroud. He smelled of wet sheep and damp earth, a primal, pathetic scent that stripped away the veneer of the corporate titan. He was shivering, his hands trembling as he tried to pour a drink, the crystal decanter clinking rhythmically against the glass. I had stepped into the room then, the very picture of the dutiful, concerned wife. I remember the way the light caught the moisture on his eyelashes, making him look as though he were weeping even before the first tear fell. Elias, I had whispered, my voice a soft velvet lure, you're freezing, let me. I took the decanter from his shaking hand. I didn't just pour the drink, I performed the act of care. I led him to the leather armchair, the one he always claimed gave him the best vantage point of his domain. As I draped a dry throw over his shoulders, I let my hand linger. I felt the frantic pulse in his neck. He looked up at me with such naked, raw desperation that I almost felt a flicker of the woman I used to be, the one who would have done anything to shield him. But that woman had been starved to death by his indifference long ago. Everything is falling apart, Alina, he'd groaned, his voice cracking like dry parchment. Julian's mess, the board, they're looking at the offshore accounts. They're looking at things they shouldn't. This was the moment. The micro expressions on his face were a map of his undoing. The twitch in his left eyelid, the way his lower lip disappeared as he bit down on his own fear. I leaned in close, so close I could see the broken capillaries in his cheeks. I chose my words with the precision of a jeweler. There is a way to bridge the gap, I told him, keeping my eyes wide and guileless. The family trust in the Caymans. If you characterize the Julian loans as a capital distribution before the auditors flag the discrepancy, the liability shifts. It becomes a private family matter, not a corporate one. You can absorb the blow without the SEC getting a foothold. I saw the hope flare in his eyes, a bright, dangerous spark. He didn't see the trap. He didn't see that by characterizing those funds, he was personally signing off on the very fraud he had previously blamed on subordinates. I was handing him a life raft made of lead. Can we do that? He'd asked, his voice a pathetic whimper. Is it legal? It's a gray area, I lied, my expression a mask of unwavering devotion. But it's the only way to protect your legacy, Elias. I've already had the paperwork drafted by the firm's junior associates. They don't know the context. They just think it's a standard restructuring. You just need to sign. He had looked at me then with such profound gratitude it was almost sickening. He thought I was saving him. He thought that in his darkest hour, the silent wife had finally found her voice to champion him. I watched him sign those documents with a flourish of his fountain pen, the ink wet and black like a fresh wound. I had tucked those papers into my folder with a steady hand, feeling the weight of his entire future shifting into my palm. Now, walking down the hall toward the grand staircase, I felt the cold air from the foyer. The rain had stopped, but the dampness remained, a heavy moisture that seemed to cling to the velvet wallpaper. I stopped at the hall mirror, adjusting the silk scarf at my neck. I looked younger somehow. The lines of tension that had defined my face for 2 decades had smoothed out, replaced by a terrifying, beautiful calm. I heard the sound of tires on the gravel driveway, low, heavy vehicles moving with purpose. The blue and red lights hadn't been activated yet, but I knew they were there. They would be discreet at first, a courtesy to a man of Elia's former standing, but the courtesy would end the moment they saw the documents I had accidentally left on the hall table, the very ones he had signed in his desperation. I walked to the front door and opened it before they could even knock. The morning air was crisp, tasting of ozone and wet stone. 2 men in dark suits stood on the porch, their expressions professional and grim. Beyond them, the world was waking up, oblivious to the fact that a dynasty had ended in a quiet study over a cup of tea and a smell of wet wool. "Mrs. Vance," one of them asked, tipping his head slightly. "He's in the study," I said, my voice as clear and cold as a mountain stream. "I believe he's been expecting you." I stepped aside, making room for them to enter. I didn't watch them go toward him. I didn't want to see the moment the handcuffs clicked or the way the last of his dignity evaporated. Instead, I walked out onto the porch and breathed in the scent of the garden. The roses were battered by the storm, their petals scattered across the stone like drops of blood, but the bushes themselves were strong. They would bloom again next year, unburdened by the weeds I had finally cleared away. I began to walk down the steps, my heels clicking a sharp, rhythmic staccato against the stone. I wasn't running. I was simply moving toward the gate. Behind me, the house, that mausoleum of my youth, seemed to shrink. I had spent half my life being the silence in the room, the background noise to other people's ambitions. Now the silence was mine, and it was the loudest thing in the world. I reached the end of the driveway just as the sun began to break through the clouds, casting long, golden fingers across the road. I didn't have a suitcase. I didn't have a plan beyond the next hour. I only had the keys to a life that finally belonged to me, and the knowledge that sometimes the most devastating weapon you can wield is simply the truth, whispered at exactly the right moment of a man's collapse. The sound of a car door closing echoed behind me, followed by the muffled, raised voices of men doing their duty. I didn't flinch. I just kept walking, the gray of the morning turning to a brilliant, blinding white. I thought about the way Julian used to laugh, a loud, barking sound that always signaled he had gotten away with something. He had inherited that from Elias, that arrogant assumption that the world was a series of locks and they were the only ones with the keys. They never considered that someone might be changing the tumblers while they slept. I thought of the ledger I had kept in the floorboard of my dressing room, a meticulous record of every loan, every gift, and every recharacterization Elias had authorized over the years. It wasn't just a book of numbers, it was a map of his hypocrisy. The rain-soaked wool smell from earlier seemed to linger in my nostrils, a ghost of his presence. It was the smell of a man who had been caught in a storm of his own making. When I had given him that advice, that sweet, poisonous suggestion to move the funds, I had watched his eyes. There is a specific way a man looks when he thinks he's smarter than the consequences of his actions. His pupils had dilated, his breathing had steadied, and for a moment he actually looked proud of himself. He thought he was being clever. He thought he was using me one last time to facilitate his escape. I felt a sharp, cold amusement at the memory. I had played the part of the submissive wife so perfectly that he never even questioned the source of the legal strategy I had presented. He didn't know that I had spent my Tuesday afternoons for the last 3 years in the back of a dusty law library in the city, or that the charity meetings he so often mocked were actually consultations with forensic accountants. He had seen me as a static object, a piece of furniture that occasionally spoke, and that was his greatest mistake. You should never ignore the person who cleans up your messes because eventually they learn exactly how you made them. As I reached the perimeter of the estate, the iron gate stood open, a symbolic gesture of the end of my imprisonment. I looked back one last time. The house was a masterpiece of architecture, all sharp angles and cold glass reflecting the pale morning light. It was a beautiful place to lose your soul, but I was taking mine with me. I felt the weight of the small silver key in my pocket, the key to a safety deposit box in a small town 3 states away. It contained enough evidence to ensure that even if Elia's high-priced lawyers managed to find a loophole in the Cayman's documents, they would never be able to explain the second set of books. I had been patient. I had been silent. I had let time do the heavy lifting, watching as their greed and their ego slowly eroded the foundations of their lives. All I had to do was wait for the rain to start and then offer a shaking man a way to stay dry. He had taken the bait because he was too cold to see the hook. The road ahead was empty, a long stretch of black asphalt winding through the trees. I started the engine of the small, unremarkable car I had parked there the night before. It wasn't a luxury sedan. It didn't have the Vance crest or the smell of expensive leather. It smelled of nothing at all, a blank slate. As I pulled away, I turned on the radio, filling the cabin with a soft orchestral swell. The music was vibrant and complex, a stark contrast to the hollow silence I had left behind. I was no longer the narrator of Elia's story. I was the author of my own, and the first chapter was already written in the wreckage I was leaving in the rearview mirror. I glanced at my hands on the steering wheel. They were steady. They didn't shake like Elia's had. They didn't reach for things that didn't belong to them like Julian's did. They were simply the hands of a woman who had finished a very long, very difficult piece of work. I drove toward the horizon, watching as the sun finally cleared the trees, burning away the last of the morning mist. The world was wide, and for the first time in 20 years, I was exactly where I was meant to be. I thought about the word devotion. It's a word men like Elia's use to describe a woman's willingness to be invisible. They want a devotion that is quiet, that doesn't demand, that doesn't observe. But true devotion is a powerful thing, and mine had been devoted to the truth of who he really was. I had studied him the way a scientist studies a specimen, noting every flaw, every weakness, and every vanity. My silence hadn't been a lack of thought, it had been a gathering of data. The trap I had set wasn't just legal, it was psychological. I knew he would choose the path of least resistance. I knew he would prioritize his reputation over his integrity. I had counted on his predictable nature, and he hadn't disappointed me. As the miles stretched between me and the Vance estate, I felt a lightness in my chest that was almost dizzying. It was the feeling of a debt being paid in full. He had taken my years, my voice, and my youth, but in return, I had taken his future. It seemed a fair trade. The landscape changed as I drove, the manicured lawns of the wealthy suburbs giving way to the wilder, unkempt beauty of the countryside. I passed small farmhouses with smoke curling from their chimneys and fields of tall grass swaying in the breeze. These were places where people lived lives that were honest and hard, far removed from the choreographed deceptions of the world I had just escaped. I didn't belong here yet, but I liked the idea of being a stranger in a place where no one knew my name or the history of the woman who had once been Mrs. Elias Vance. I pulled over at a small roadside diner an hour later. The air inside smelled of burnt coffee and fried bacon, a honest, humble smell. I sat in a vinyl booth and watched the people around me. They were talking, laughing, arguing about trivial things. They were alive in a way Elia's had never been. I ordered a coffee and sat with my back to the window, feeling the warmth of the sun through the glass. I was no longer waiting for the other shoe to drop. I was the one who had dropped it. And as I took my first sip of the bitter, hot liquid, I realized that the most beautiful sound in the world wasn't music or laughter. It was the absolute, perfect silence of a job well done. The waitress, a woman with tired eyes and a kind smile, refilled my cup. "You look like you've come a long way," she said, pausing with the pot. "I have," I replied, and for the first time in a very long time, I didn't have to hide the truth behind a mask. "But I think I've finally arrived." I watched her move on to the next table, her life simple and grounded. I didn't envy her, but I respected her. She was the architect of her own day, just as I was now the architect of mine. I opened my purse and took out a small notebook, flipping to a blank page. I had a lot of things to write down, plans for the future, places I wanted to see, a life I wanted to build from the ground up. The pen felt heavy in my hand, a tool of creation rather than a weapon of destruction. I began to write, the words flowing onto the paper with a grace I hadn't known I possessed. The storm was over, the ruins were behind me, and the road ahead was mine to choose. As I sit here in this vinyl booth, the steam from my coffee rising in a slow, ghostly curl, my mind drifts back to the night the foundation finally gave way. It is easy to look at the wreckage from a distance, but the actual moment of collapse was a symphony of precision and sound. It happened only 48 hours ago, though it feels like a lifetime has passed. I can still feel the weight of the manila folder in my hand, the one that contained the meticulously documented proof of Julian's systematic embezzlement from the firm's private accounts. Julian, Elia's most trusted partner and oldest friend, had become a man possessed by his own appetites, and those appetites had finally outgrown his reach. He had come to the house that evening in a state of frantic, sweating desperation. I saw him through the side light of the front door before he even rang the bell. He looked diminished, his expensive Italian suit hanging off shoulders that seemed to have shrunk under the pressure of his mounting debts. He thought he could save himself by burning someone else down. He had come to blackmail Elias, armed with half-truths and fragments of secrets he'd scavenged over the years. What he didn't know was that I had already rewritten the script. I had accidentally left the folder on the heavy mahogany sideboard in the gallery, just outside the double doors of Elia's study. I placed it there with the practiced carelessness of a woman who was losing her grip on the details, a role I had played with increasing frequency to lull them both into a sense of superiority. I knew Elias would see it. He noticed everything that didn't belong in his perfectly ordered world. I also knew that Julian, in his panicked state, would see it as a lifeline or a weapon, not realizing it was a noose. I retreated into the shadows of the long hallway that connected the gallery to the north wing. This hallway was my sanctuary of observation. It was lined with portraits of men who had built the Vance fortune on the backs of others, their painted eyes cold and judgmental. The air there always smelled of lemon oil and the faint, metallic tang of the radiator pipes. I stood perfectly still, my back against the silk flocked wallpaper, the texture of the raised damask pattern pressing into my spine like a secret. The house was unnervingly quiet, a vast, hollow vessel of stone and wood that seemed to be holding its breath along with me. I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock at the far end of the hall, each second sounding like a hammer hitting an anvil. Then the heavy oak doors of the study groaned open. I heard Julian's voice first, thin, reedy, and vibrating with a frantic energy. You don't understand, Elias, Julian hissed, his footsteps uneven on the hardwood. I have enough to bury you. Those offshore transfers, the restructuring of the Davenport assets, it's all there. But we can make this go away. We're brothers, aren't we? There was a long, terrifying silence. I could imagine Elias sitting behind his desk, his fingers steepled, his face a mask of bored contempt. Then I heard the rustle of paper, the folder. Julian must have grabbed it from the sideboard on his way in, thinking he was presenting his own evidence, or perhaps Elias had snatched it up first. The silence stretched until it felt like the walls themselves might crack under the tension. Brothers, Elias' voice was a low, dangerous rumble. It was the sound of a predator that had just realized the prey was already in the trap. You speak of brotherhood while you've been bleeding the firm dry for 3 years, Julian. You thought I wouldn't notice the discrepancies in the pension fund. You thought you were clever enough to hide behind these shell companies. What? No, that's not Elias. Look at the documents. That's not what I brought. Julian's voice rose to a panicked shriek. I don't know where those came from. I was talking about I am looking at them, Elias interrupted, and the coldness in his tone was sharper than any blade. It's all here, every ledger, every diverted wire transfer. You were so busy trying to find dirt on me that you left a trail of your own filth a mile wide. The confrontation turned physical with a suddenness that made my heart hammer against my ribs. I heard the sharp, crystalline clink of a glass decanter hitting the floor, followed by the unmistakable, explosive shatter of crystal. The scent of expensive, aged scotch wafted into the hallway, thick and cloying. Then came the heavy, dull thud of a chair being overturned, a sound that carried the weight of a body behind it. I stayed in the darkness, my breath shallow and silent. The house felt alive around me, the floorboards vibrating with the force of their struggle. It was as if the building were finally purging the rot that had lived within its walls for decades. I heard the muffled sound of a blow, a sharp intake of breath, and then the scrape of shoes against the parquet floor. Get out, Elias said. The words weren't shouted, they were spat with a visceral loathing that seemed to vibrate through the very studs of the house. If I see you near this office or near my wife or within 100 miles of the firm again, I will hand this folder to the federal prosecutor myself. You are finished, Julian. You are a ghost. A moment later, Julian stumbled out of the study. He didn't see me in the shadows of the hallway. His face was a mask of ruin, his lip bleeding, his eyes wide and vacant as if he had looked into an abyss and found it staring back. He fled toward the front door, his footsteps echoing like a frantic heartbeat against the marble of the foyer. The heavy front door slammed shut with a finality that shook the portraits on the wall. I remained in the hallway for a long time after he left. The silence that followed was different than the one before. It was heavy, laden with the dust of a destroyed partnership. I could hear Elias moving in the study, the sound of him picking up the pieces of the broken decanter, the slide of the chair being righted. He thought he had won. He thought he had successfully excised a tumor and saved himself. He had no idea that the folder he held, the one that had ruined Julian, was only the first chapter of the book I had written for him. I looked down at my hands in the dim light of the hallway. They were steady. I felt a strange, detached sense of wonder at the architecture of the moment. I had stood in that house for years, a silent fixture as invisible as the air. I had listened to their boasts, their lies, and their schemes, and I had used the very materials of their lives to build their cages. The house, with its high ceilings and its history of gilded misery, no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a stage where the final act was drawing to a close. The waitress at the diner brings me another cup of coffee, snapping me back to the present. The sun is higher now, casting long, bright rectangles across the floor. I pick up my pen and return to my notebook. The sounds of the breaking glass and the thud of the chair are echoes now, fading into the distance of a life I have outgrown. Elias is likely still sitting in that study, surrounded by the smell of spilled scotch and the wreckage of his oldest friendship, believing he is still the master of his domain. He hasn't yet realized that the silence he so cherished from me wasn't submission. It was the sound of the clock ticking down to zero. And as I write the first lines of my new life, I know that the house on the hill is finally, beautifully empty. The news did not break, it shattered. It began with a low rumble of whispers in the local business journals and escalated within 48 hours into a full scale media eclipse. The sirens were the first thing I heard that Tuesday morning, a discordant wail that tore through the manicured silence of our neighborhood like a serrated blade. I stood by the floor to ceiling windows of the breakfast nook, a lukewarm cup of herbal tea in my hands, and watched as the black SUVs swarmed the driveway. The light from the police cruisers bounced off the white Doric columns of the porch, strobing in blue and red, turning our sanctuary into a crime scene. I watched Elias being led out in handcuffs. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him, his expensive charcoal suit jacket draped awkwardly over his shoulders, his face a pale mask of indignation that was rapidly dissolving into raw, naked panic. The flashbulbs of the paparazzi, who had somehow arrived before the police had even cleared the perimeter, clicked like 1,000 tiny shutters closing on his reputation. In the weeks that followed, my life became a series of sterile rooms and heavy, cream-colored bond paper. As the spouse who was blissfully unaware of the intricate web of embezzlement and racketeering, I was thrust into the role of the tragic, confused figurehead. I spent hours in the offices of Harrison, Sterling, and Lowe, a firm that specialized in white-collar catastrophe. The environment was always the same, freezing air conditioning that seemed designed to preserve the mahogany furniture, the scent of expensive leather and stale espresso, and the oppressive weight of silence. I sat across from lawyers whose eyes remained fixed on their gold watches, their voices hushed as if they were speaking in a cathedral. They treated me with a delicate, almost condescending reverence. To them, I was a porcelain doll that had accidentally been placed on a shelf above a furnace. The documents were the most tactile part of the ordeal. I was forced to handle thousands of pages of evidence, affidavits, and bank statements. The paper was heavy, the edges sharp enough to draw blood if I wasn't careful. I spent my afternoons running my fingertips over the embossed seals and the cold, black ink of signatures that once meant security but now meant ruin. I learned the texture of betrayal. I could feel the grit of their greed in every line item. There was a strange, perverse satisfaction in the physical weight of the files. They were the bricks of the prison I had helped them build, and now I was being asked to help the architects count them. I would sit there, my head bowed, letting my hair fall forward to hide the lack of tears in my eyes, while the lawyers explained complicated financial structures to me as if I were a child learning my ABCs. I nodded, I blinked rapidly, and I let my hands tremble just enough to keep the illusion alive. Then there was Detective Miller Vance, the lead investigator for the state's Financial Crimes Division. Vance was a man who clearly believed he was the protagonist of a gritty noir novel. He wore suits that were slightly too large and smelled perpetually of peppermint and old coffee. He had a way of leaning across the table, his eyes narrowed as if he were trying to peer through my skull to the secrets beneath. He thought he was clever. He thought he could catch me in a lie by asking the same question in 5 different ways, waiting for a slip in my clueless persona. He didn't realize that I wasn't lying, I was simply curating the truth. "Mrs. Thorne," he would say, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. It's hard for us to believe a woman of your intelligence didn't notice the sudden influx of offshore transfers in 2019. Your name is on the secondary account for the holding company. I would look at him with a practiced vacuity, my voice soft and slightly strained. Elias always told me those were for the charitable trust detective. He handled all the heavy lifting, as he called it. He said I shouldn't worry my head about the technicalities of the firm. I trusted him. He's my husband. I watched Vance's expression soften just a fraction. It was the pity that did it. Men like Vance are suckers for a woman they believe they can protect or, better yet, outsmart. I fed him just enough truth to keep him hungry. I found a series of ledgers in the back of a cedar chest in the attic, ledgers I had meticulously organized months prior, and handed them over with a look of horrified realization. I pointed out inconsistencies in Julian's expense reports that I claimed I had only just noticed while looking for household receipts. I played the part of the grieving, betrayed wife so perfectly that Vance began to view me as his greatest asset rather than a suspect. He started bringing me coffee. He started lowering his guard, sharing details of the mounting evidence against Elias and Julian as if we were partners in the pursuit of justice. He didn't see the way I watched him. I studied the way his eyes lit up when he thought he'd found a smoking gun that I had conveniently placed in his path. I saw the arrogance in the way he patted his notebook, convinced he was the one pulling the strings. In reality, he was merely the wind I was using to fan the flames. Every clue I gave him was a nail in the coffin of their partnership. I ensured that the evidence against Julian was just damning enough to make him turn on Elias, and the evidence against Elias was just heavy enough to make him feel there was no way out but to drag Julian down with him. I was the silent conductor of their mutual destruction, all while sitting in a hard plastic chair in an interrogation room, looking like I was one loud noise away from a nervous breakdown. The media circus continued outside, a swirling vortex of cameras and microphones. They called it the Gilded Fraud, a title that made me smile in the privacy of my own mind. They painted Elias as the mastermind and Julian as the opportunistic shadow. They portrayed me as the silent victim, the woman who had lived in a house of cards without ever realizing the wind was blowing. I watched the evening news and saw images of myself leaving the courthouse, my face shielded by a silk scarf, my arm linked with a junior associate from the law firm. The commentators spoke about the tragedy of the innocent spouse, their voices dripping with a mixture of voyeuristic glee and genuine pity. I let them have their pity. Pity is a powerful cloak. It obscures the sharp edges of a person's character and makes others blind to the possibility of calculation. While the world felt sorry for the woman who had lost her husband to his own avarice, I was busy finalizing the details of my exit. The legal documents I handled weren't just evidence, they were my roadmap. I knew exactly which accounts would be frozen and which ones, tucked away in the names of defunct shell companies I had quietly diverted funds into years ago, would remain untouched. I knew which properties would be seized and which ones were protected by the very prenuptial agreements Elias had insisted upon to protect his assets from me. As I sat in the lawyer's office one final time, signing the last of the affidavits that would effectively bury Elias and Julian under a mountain of federal charges, I felt a profound sense of lightness. The cold, sterile air no longer felt oppressive, it felt clean. The lead investigator, Vance, stood by the door, watching me with that same look of misguided sympathy. He thought the case was closed because he had found the culprits. He didn't realize the real story was sitting right in front of him, dabbing her eyes with a linen handkerchief and thanking him for his kindness. I walked out of that office and into the bright, chaotic glare of the afternoon sun. The weight of their greed finally lifted from my shoulders and placed squarely on theirs. The silence was over, and the rest, as I had planned, would be handled by time. Total word count 1073. The transition from the velvet lined world I had inhabited for 25 years to the county detention center was a sensory shock I hadn't fully prepared for, despite my meticulous planning. The air outside had been crisp, smelling of impending rain and expensive exhaust, but the moment the heavy steel doors groaned shut behind me, the atmosphere changed. It became thick with the scent of industrial-grade bleach, a sharp, acrid odor that didn't so much clean the air as it did burn the nostrils. It was the smell of forced penance, a chemical attempt to scrub away the desperation of the thousands who had passed through these corridors. I walked with a measured pace, my heels clicking rhythmically against the linoleum, a sound that felt inappropriately sharp in the heavy, dampened silence of the facility. The guard leading me didn't speak. He only adjusted his belt, the jingle of his keys providing a metallic counterpoint to my footsteps. We reached the visiting area, a space defined by its lack of warmth. The walls were painted a shade of institutional beige that seemed designed to drain the color from a person's skin. I was led to a small cubicle, one of many separated by thick, reinforced glass that bore the faint, greasy smudges of previous visitors' foreheads and palms. I sat on the bolted-down stool, the cold metal seeping through the fabric of my wool coat. Above me, the fluorescent lights hummed with a low-frequency vibration that I could feel in the bridge of my nose. They were merciless, flickering just enough to be irritating, casting a sickly, blue-tinted pallor over everything. They didn't just illuminate the room, they stripped it of any possible shadow or sacred. In this light, there was no room for the soft focus illusions Elias had built his life upon. Then the door on the other side opened. Elias walked in, and for a moment I didn't recognize the man I had shared a bed with for over 2 decades. The bespoke Italian wool was gone, replaced by a shapeless, coarse orange jumpsuit that made his shoulders look narrow and his posture frail. He hadn't shaved in days, and the silver stubble on his jawline looked like frost on a dying field. He looked diminished, as if the very air in this place was slowly deflating him. When he saw me, a spark of the old Elias, the arrogant, commanding patriarch, flickered in his eyes. He sat down heavily, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, and reached for the telephone receiver hanging on the wall. I did the same, the plastic cold against my ear. "Catherine," he breathed, his voice a ragged shadow of its former resonance. "You have to get me out of here. The lawyers, they're saying things, ridiculous things. They're talking about Julian turning state's evidence. It's a mess. You need to call Miller, tell him to release the contingency funds from the offshore account in the Caymans. We need the best defense money can buy." I looked at him through the glass, really looked at him, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to fill the silence with a reassuring word or a gentle touch. I let the hum of the room sit between us. I watched him blink, his confusion growing as the seconds ticked by without my usual compliance. "There are no contingency funds, Elias," I said. My voice was different, clearer, lower, stripped of the hesitant lilt I had used as a shield for so long. It sounded foreign even to me, the voice of a woman who was no longer asking for permission to exist. He frowned, leaning closer to the glass, his breath fogging the surface. "What are you talking about? Of course there are. I set them up myself 5 years ago. I showed you the ledgers." "You showed me what you wanted me to see," I replied, my gaze steady. "But you forgot that I was the one who organized your filing system. I was the one who handled the charitable donations that required my signature. I was the one who sat in the corner of your study reading my books while you and Julian discussed the nuances of shell companies as if I were a piece of furniture. The confusion in his eyes shifted, a shadow of unease creeping in. Catherine, this isn't the time for games. I'm in trouble. I know, I said. I'm the one who put you here. The silence that followed was absolute. It was as if the humming lights had suddenly cut out, leaving us in a vacuum. Elia's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. He looked at me as if I had suddenly sprouted a second head, or as if I were a stranger who had somehow stolen his wife's face. I watched the realization begin its slow, agonizing crawl across his features. It started in his eyes, a widening of the pupils, a sudden, frantic scanning of my expression. Then his jaw tightened, the muscles corded and strained. You, he whispered, the word barely a puff of air against the receiver. No, you couldn't. You don't have you wouldn't know how. I knew how to do everything you thought I was too simple to understand, I told him, the words coming easily now like water breaking through a dam. I knew about the smoking gun notebook Julian kept. I'm the one who made sure he left it in the glove box of the car he took to the airport. I'm the one who tipped off the SEC about the discrepancies in the Dover account, the one you thought was untraceable because you deburied it under 3 layers of false identities. I didn't just watch you, Elias, I studied you. I learned your patterns, your weaknesses, and most importantly, your overbearing pride. He gripped the receiver so hard his knuckles turned white, the plastic creaking under the pressure. Why? He hissed, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. I gave you everything, the house, the clothes, the life. You were nothing before me. I was silent before you, I corrected him. And you mistook that silence for nothingness. You thought you were the architect of our life, but you were just the one who signed the checks. I was the one who made sure the foundation was built on sand. You took advantage of my quietness, Elias. You used it as a canvas to project your own ego. You thought I was a mirror, reflecting back the man you wanted to be. But mirrors don't just reflect, they also show you the things you're trying to hide. I leaned forward, my face only inches from the glass. The bleach smell seemed to intensify, or perhaps it was just the cold reality of the moment settling in. I let time handle the rest. I waited for your greed to outpace your caution. I waited for Julian to become just desperate enough to be manipulated. And then I simply stepped out of the way and let the momentum of your own crimes carry you both over the edge. The horror on his face was a masterpiece of my own making. He looked at me and saw, for the first light of day, the woman he had spent 25 years ignoring. He saw the calculation, the patience, and the cold, hard brilliance that he had dismissed as feminine flightiness. He realized that the person he thought he had been protecting, the innocent spouse the media was currently weeping for, was the very person who had tightened the noose around his neck. You're a monster, he spat, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and loathing. No, I said softly, a small, genuine smile touching my lips for the first time in years. I'm just a woman who finally found her voice, and I think you'll find that in this place, silence is the only thing you have left. I hung up the receiver. The click of the plastic hitting the cradle was the final punctuation mark on our marriage. I stood up, smoothing the front of my coat, feeling the weight of the decades falling away. I didn't look back as I walked toward the heavy steel door. I didn't need to. I could hear him screaming my name through the glass, a muffled, frantic sound that was quickly swallowed by the hum of the lights and the smell of the bleach. As I stepped back out into the cool, evening air, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold. I took a deep breath, the air clean and sharp, and began to walk. The silence was no longer a cage, it was a kingdom, and for the first time in my life, I was the only one who held the keys. Total word count 1084. The driveway was no longer a stage for the choreographed arrivals of luxury sedans and town cars. Today, it was clogged with the utilitarian presence of three massive, unmarked white vans. The men moving in and out of the front doors didn't wear the tailored suits of Elia's associates or the stiff, silent uniforms of the domestic staff I had dismissed weeks ago. These men wore heavy-duty canvas trousers and T-shirts damp with sweat, their movements brisk and devoid of any reverence for the objects they carried. To them, the 16th century Flemish tapestry was merely a heavy, dusty fabric that needed to be rolled and labeled. The Louis XIV chairs were just awkward shapes that required extra padding. I stood on the marble landing of the grand staircase, my hand resting lightly on the cold iron banister, watching the physical architecture of my life being dismantled piece by piece. There was a profound, resonant hollow growing in the center of the house. Each time a rug was pulled up, the acoustics of the room changed, the sharp edges of the walls no longer muffled by wool and silk. The house was beginning to find its voice again, a stark, echoing tone that hummed with the truth of empty space. I moved toward the dining room, a cavernous space that had hosted hundreds of high-stakes negotiations disguised as dinner parties. I watched two men hoist the mahogany dining table, a monstrosity that could seat 24 and had been custom-built to Elia's specifications of unassailable dominance. It took four of them to tip it onto its side. As they unscrewed the heavy, clawed legs, I felt a phantom weight lift from my own chest. I remembered sitting at the head of that table, the air thick with the smell of expensive wine and the even more expensive lies being traded across the polish. I had sat there for decades, a silent fixture, as much a part of the decor as the silver candelabras. Elias had loved the way I looked at the end of that table. I was the perfect finishing touch to his portrait of success. He never realized that while he was busy performing for his guests, I was cataloging every slip of the tongue, every nervous twitch of his loyal partners, and every discrepancy in the numbers they whispered when they thought the quiet wife was distracted by the floral arrangements. The movers grunted as they hauled the tabletop toward the door, the wood groaning in protest. Once it was gone, the room looked different. The sunlight, usually filtered through heavy velvet drapes that had already been removed, spilled across the hardwood floors in long, unapologetic rectangles. The dust motes danced in the light, disturbed by the sudden activity, revealing the pale outlines on the floor where the furniture had once anchored the room's pretension. I walked to the center of the empty space, my heels clicking sharply against the wood. The sound was bright and clear. For 25 years, I had walked on eggshells and thick Persian carpets, my footsteps swallowed by the house's demand for a subdued, feminine presence. Now the floor echoed back at me, acknowledging my weight, my presence, and my survival. I retreated to the master suite, the one room that had felt most like a gilded cage. On the vanity sat the velvet-lined boxes I had prepared. I sat down on the stool, one of the few items not yet tagged for the liquidators, and began the final ritual of my transformation. I reached for my neck, my fingers finding the clasp of the heavy gold collar Elias had bought me for our 20th anniversary. It was a beautiful piece, thick and suffocating, designed to draw the eye and announce the depth of his pockets. As I unhooked it, the cold metal slid through my fingers like a dying snake. I laid it in the box and did the same with the matching bracelets, the ones that had always felt like elegant shackles. Then came the rings, the 10-carat diamond that had sat on my finger like a lead weight, a constant reminder of the contract I had signed with my silence. I pulled it off, noting the faint, pale indentation it left on my skin, a temporary scar that would soon fade. I looked at my bare hands in the mirror. They looked lighter, more capable. For years, people had commented on how well kept I was, as if I were a vintage car or a manicured garden. They didn't see the calluses on my mind. I looked at my reflection, really looked at it, without the distraction of the heavy jewelry I had described to the lawyers as my only solace. The woman in the mirror wasn't a victim of her husband's greed or a bystander to his downfall. She was the architect of the silence that had eventually entombed him. I realized then that those years of being the quiet one were not a prison sentence. They were a cocoon. Inside that silence, I had been changing, hardening, and learning. I had watched Elias and Julian operate with the arrogance of men who believed that if a person didn't speak, they didn't think. I had used their own prejudice as my primary camouflage. While they were busy shouting their ambitions to the rafters, I was in the cellar, quietly loosening the stones of the foundation. A mover appeared in the doorway, looking slightly sheepish. "Ma'am, the library is cleared. We're moving to the upstairs guest rooms now." "Thank you," I said, my voice steady. "Please take everything. If it isn't on the list of personal effects I gave you, it goes." I followed him downstairs, passing the library. It was a skeletal version of its former self. The thousands of leather-bound books, most of which Elias had never opened, bought by the foot to fill the shelves, were gone. The room smelled of old paper and cedar, but the oppressive atmosphere of important business had evaporated. This was where the toxicity had been most concentrated. This was where the plans for the shell companies had been hatched, where the offshore accounts had been managed, and where Julian had sat day after day, thinking he was the smartest man in the room because he knew how to move numbers around a spreadsheet. I stood in the doorway and took a deep breath. The air was clean. The purging I had envisioned for so long was nearly complete. The house was no longer a monument to a man who was currently sitting in a 6 by 9 cell, wondering where it all went wrong. It was just a structure of stone and glass. The victory I felt wasn't cinematic. There were no explosions, no dramatic confrontations in the rain. It was a quiet, permanent triumph. It was the feeling of a fever finally breaking. As the last of the heavy furniture was loaded into the vans, the house felt lighter, as if it were rising a few inches out of the ground. The toxicity had been bled out of it, sold off to the highest bidders at auction houses and liquidators. I walked out onto the front terrace as the sun began to dip below the tree line, casting long, golden shadows across the lawn. The vans pulled away, their engines rumbling down the long, winding drive. When the sound faded, the silence that followed was different from any I had known before. It wasn't the heavy, expectant silence of a house waiting for its master to return. It wasn't the fearful silence of a wife trying not to be noticed. It was the silence of a blank page. It was a wide, open territory that belonged entirely to me. I stood there for a long time, watching the sky turn from gold to a deep, bruising violet. I didn't feel lonely. I didn't feel regret. I felt the immense, terrifying, and beautiful weight of my own freedom. I had let time handle the rest, and time had been more than fair. I reached into my pocket and felt the cool metal of the single key I had kept, not to this house, which would be sold by the bank by the end of the month, but to the small, modest apartment in the city I had leased under my own name. I took one last look at the empty shell of the estate, turned my back on it, and walked toward my car. The silence was no longer a cage, it was my kingdom, and the air was finally thin enough to breathe. Total word count 1073. I didn't look in the rearview mirror as I drove away. There is a specific kind of liberation in refusing to witness the finality of a departure, a grace in simply letting the past remain behind the glass. The tires crunched over the gravel of the long driveway, a sound that had once signaled the arrival of men who brought chaos with them, but now it was merely the sound of my own exit. As I reached the main road, the heavy canopy of the estate's ancient oaks gave way to the wide, unrelenting sky. I drove for hours, watching the landscape shift from the manicured, suffocating greenery of the suburbs to the rugged, salt scrubbed reaches of the coast. The air began to change, cooling and sharpening, carrying the scent of brine and decaying kelp, a scent that felt more honest than the expensive perfumes and floor waxes of my former life. My new home is a modest cottage nestled on a bluff where the Atlantic exerts its constant, rhythmic pressure against the shore. It is a structure of weathered cedar and stone, small enough that I can hear the wind whistling through the eaves from every room. When I arrived, the sun was a dying ember on the horizon, casting a pale silver light across the water. I carried my few bags inside, the floorboards creaking a welcome that felt earned rather than bought. There were no servants to take my coat, no Julian to offer a drink laced with a hidden agenda, and no Elias to demand an account of my day. There was only the smell of fresh cedar from the walls and the faint, underlying tang of the sea. I sat on a simple wooden chair in the center of the living room and listened. For the first time in decades, the silence wasn't a vacuum I had to fill with caution. It was a presence thick and comforting as a wool blanket. In the weeks that followed, I settled into a routine that would have horrified the men I left behind. I wake with the tide, my internal clock finally decoupled from the frantic demands of legal briefs and social obligations. I spend my mornings walking the narrow strip of beach below the bluff, my boots sinking into the wet sand, leaving prints that the next wave efficiently erases. There is a profound peace in that erasure. Elias spent his entire life trying to carve his name into the world, building monuments of glass and steel, thinking that legacy was something you could manufacture through sheer force of will. He never understood that the world has a way of smoothing itself out, of reclaiming what was taken through greed. I think of him often now, but not with the bitterness that used to keep me awake. I think of him in his cell, a man who defined himself by the space he occupied and the people he controlled, now confined to a space no larger than a walk-in closet. I imagine the noise of the prison, the clanging of metal, the shouting of men who have nothing left but their voices, the constant, abrasive friction of lives stripped of privacy. For a man like Elias, who thrived on the illusion of importance, the anonymity of a jumpsuit and a number must be a living death. He is trapped in a prison of his own making, a structure built from the very shortcuts and deceptions he thought made him superior. He had always assumed I was the one trapped, a quiet fixture in his grand house, never realizing that my silence was a choice while his noise was a necessity, a desperate attempt to drown out the emptiness of his own soul. Julian, too, has found his own version of a cage. Without Elia's shadow to hide in, and with the financial structures he helped build dismantled by the investigators I so carefully guided, he is a man adrift. I heard through the few channels I haven't closed that he is embroiled in endless litigation, his reputation a charred ruin. He was a man who lived for the smart play, the clever manipulation of numbers and people. Now he is forced to live with the consequences of his own cleverness. He is likely sitting in some sterile office, surrounded by lawyers who charge him by the minute, realizing too late that he was never the architect of his own fortune. He was merely a scavenger who mistook his luck for genius. They are both rotting in the ruins of their own egos while I sit by the sea and watch the fog roll in. The strength I found in waiting was never a passive thing. It was an active, simmering power. I remember the years of sitting at dinner parties, nodding while Elias spoke over me, or watching Julian's eyes dart around the room as he looked for his next mark. They thought my silence was a sign of submission, a lack of fire. They didn't realize that I was observing the cracks in their foundation, noting every slip of the tongue and every moment of hubris. I was like the water against the cliffside, persistent, patient, and ultimately transformative. You don't need to scream to bring down a wall. You just need to know where the structural weaknesses are and wait for the frost to do its work. Inside my cottage, the simplicity is my greatest luxury. I have a small library now, filled with books I actually want to read, their spines cracked and their pages dog-eared. There is a wood-burning stove that provides a dry, honest heat and a kitchen where I prepare simple meals that taste of nothing but themselves. I find myself touching the surfaces of things, the rough grain of the cedar table, the cool ceramic of a tea mug, and feeling a connection to the physical world that I hadn't felt in years. In the big house, everything was mediated by cost and status. Here, everything is mediated by utility and beauty. Sometimes, as the evening light fades to a deep, bruised charcoal, I stand on the deck and look out at the horizon. The ocean doesn't care about shell companies or offshore accounts. It doesn't care about the pride of men who think they own the earth. It is a vast, indifferent power, and in its presence, my own smallness feels like a victory. I am no longer a character in someone else's drama. I am the sole occupant of my own life. The silence I cultivated for so long has bloomed into something magnificent. It is no longer a weapon I have to keep sharpened in the dark. It is the atmosphere I breathe. I realize now that they took advantage of my silence because they were afraid of what it might contain. They filled the air with their voices because they couldn't stand the thought of what they might hear if they were ever truly still. They were right to be afraid. In the stillness, I found the clarity to see them for exactly what they were. I let time handle the rest because I knew that time is the one thing that cannot be bribed, bullied, or outrun. It eventually brings everything to its natural conclusion. The wind picks up, rattling the cedar shingles, and I breathe in the cold, clean air. It is thin and sharp, and it tastes of freedom. My silence was never a weakness. It was a weapon that I simply chose when to draw, and having used it to cut my way out of the thicket of their lies, I can finally enjoy the silence for what it truly is: the absence of them, the presence of me, and the infinite, beautiful space in between. I go inside, close the door, and let the world outside continue its long, slow work of forgetting the men who thought they were kings. I am home. If you like this story, please subscribe. Thanks.